Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a fascinating and honestly deeply challenging set of research papers by independent researcher Siddhartha Warden. The overarching premise we're exploring today is going to turn a lot of what we think we know about American politics completely upside down. We're going to look at the structural reality of the United States political system. But we're not doing it through the lens of those daily cable news shouting matches, Instead, we're looking at the hard historical and legal architecture that actually governs the country. The sources we're exploring today argue that the intense partisan warfare we see every single day is actually masking a unified, highly durable system of elite control.
And that brings us to a highly provocative hook question. Did the political parties actually switch, or did they just swap masks? You've probably heard the historical narrative about the Great Party Switch, this idea that sometime in the 20th century, Democrats and Republicans essentially traded voter bases and ideological platforms, especially around civil rights. Well, the research we're looking at argues that this famous switch is, in many ways, a massive public deception. The author's argument here is that the parties didn't fundamentally alter the power structure at all. They just swapped masks. Underneath the changing brands and all that shifting campaign rhetoric, the sources argue that a shared, elite system of control has remained completely intact.
Section 1. The Illusion of Partisan Politics.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core of Warden's argument. We're looking impartially at how the provided research characterizes the U.S. system. Rather than a purely participatory democracy, where the will of the majority dictates policy, the author argues the U.S. functions much more accurately as a managed republic. Publicly, we're fed a very clear narrative, right? Democrats defend civil rights and the working class, while Republicans act as staunch conservatives. But when you look at the shared outcomes, the story totally changes. The sources document how deeply punitive legislation, things like the 1994 Crime Bill, welfare reform, and the Patriot Act, were passed with heavy bipartisan backing. In the end, both parties ultimately voted to expand the state's power.
Which brings us to a foundational definition from the research: the managed republic. The author traces this concept all the way back to the constitutional architecture of the United States, specifically to James Madison. Madison actually explicitly noted that the government should be arranged to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. According to the sources, a managed republic stabilizes elite continuity. It protects those with capital and property while managing the consent of the general public by rotating those partisan brands, the red and blue masks. It keeps voters feeling like they have a fundamental choice, even when the underlying structural policies barely shift at all.
Section 2. The Architecture of Control.
So if this managed republic exists, how exactly is it enforced? Well, it's done through legal machinery that just keeps humming along, regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office. The research points out a surprisingly ironic fact here. The trajectory of expanding police discretion was actually initiated by Supreme Court justices appointed by Lyndon B. Johnson, a president historically famous for civil rights progress. Starting in 1968, you have Terry v. Ohio, which allowed stop and frisk based on mere reasonable suspicion. That expanded in 1977 with the Mims decision, allowing officers to order drivers out of cars. By 1996, the Wren decision legally insulated pretextual traffic stops. And then by 2009, the Johnson case extended that logic to passengers. Over decades, through both liberal and conservative eras, the legal architecture authorizing everyday encounters and state control only grew stronger.
But this isn't just about the courts. It's heavily legislative, too. The research tracks systemic, bipartisan control tactics passed across widely different presidential administrations. Take the 1993 Voter Registration Act signed by Bill Clinton. The sources note it contained provisions that were later weaponized to purge voter rolls and suppress turnout. Then there's the 1994 Crime Bill, which massively expanded the carceral state. And of course, the post-9/11 Patriot Act, which broadened mass surveillance to an absolutely unprecedented degree. The sources really stress this point. Both major parties actively built this architecture of control.
Section 3. The Carceral Economy. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the research connects the legal framework to the economic engine. Wardham provides a severe critique of the U.S. penal system. We're all taught that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the author highlights a critical constitutional loophole right in the text, except as a punishment for crime. The research argues this specific clause legally permitted a new form of mass coercion. Basically, you could maintain captive labor simply by relabeling people as criminals.
And the modern result of that loophole is staggering. Over 5 million adults are currently under some form of correctional control in the U.S. This creates a massive captive labor pool. The research neutrally reports a reality that might shock a lot of people. Major corporate supply chains, even those associated with progressive values like Whole Foods, right alongside massive brands like McDonald's and Tesla, have profited immensely from this carceral system. It's a foundational, deeply embedded part of the broader political economy.
Section 4. Wealth, Surveillance, and Empire. Shifting from domestic control to macroeconomic realities, consider this striking number, 290 to 1. According to data cited in the research, this is the estimated ratio of what a CEO makes compared to a typical worker as of 2023. It visually anchors the author's argument about the extreme economic inequality that a managed republic naturally produces. Because while the political parties get on TV and argue endlessly over marginal tax rates, this massive chasm in wealth generation just continues to widen, totally unabated.
And that CEO pay ratio is directly connected to this stark wealth concentration. The top 10% of the population holds 60% of all the wealth, leaving the remaining 90% of the entire country to fight over the leftover 40%. The source notes a deeply unsettling reality here. Despite being in one of the wealthiest nations in human history, roughly 60% of Americans report living paycheck to paycheck. The research suggests this precarity isn't an accident. It's a feature of the system, keeping the public focused purely on daily survival rather than organizing for structural political change.
So, how do you manage a public under those conditions? Increasingly, it's done through what the author calls surveillance capitalism. Private entities, from massive asset managers like BlackRock to tech giants like Meta, wield immense sociopolitical power. They shape our information, our behavior, and ultimately policy agendas, and they do it without a single shred of electoral accountability. The sources refer to this dynamic as inverted totalitarianism, a state where corporate power silently dictates civic life, making actual democratic participation incredibly thin.
But this control doesn't stop at the border. Look at this staggering number, 750. That is the estimated amount of United States overseas military bases, spread across roughly 80 different countries around the globe. The author argues that this global footprint represents a massive architecture of empire and realpolitik. Bipartisan foreign policy continually drives this expansion to secure resource access and geostrategic dominance. But it's almost always masked by moral language. It's sold to the public as freedom operations or interventions for human rights. The actual human cost, though, is devastating. The research cites over 940,000 direct deaths resulting from post-9/11 wars alone. And again, Wardixan points out that this foreign policy architecture remains virtually identical, whether the administration in charge is wearing a red tie or a blue tie.
Section 5. A blueprint for real reform.
Now, I know this is a really heavy analysis, but the author doesn't just leave us there. He provides concrete, actionable solutions to reclaim public governance. So the crucial point is this: doctrinal durability is not destiny. The author's thesis is that venting outrage on social media or just changing the personalities in office will never be enough. The real problem is a shortage of statutory specificity. We literally have to change the foundational laws on the books.
To that end, the sources outline a very specific legislative playbook to dismantle the policing machinery established by Terry v. Ohio. Instead of vague, feel-good calls for better training, legislatures must step in directly. 1. Codify strict behavior-based standards for reasonable suspicion. 2. Completely prohibit pretextual traffic stops for minor issues, like a broken taillight. 3. Limit that MIMS logic so officers cannot order people out of vehicles without a specific, articulable safety risk. And 4. Mandate immediate, public stop data reporting with independent auditing.
But police reform is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. To shift power away from a corporate duopoly and build a genuine democratic system, the research highlights the need for a totally new democratic political economy. This means establishing a universal social floor, guaranteeing healthcare, housing, and education for everyone. It requires implementing robust voting laws like automatic voter registration and independent redistricting to end structural suppression. It demands strict anti-monopoly enforcement to break up extreme wealth concentration. And finally, it requires adopting a true diplomacy-first foreign policy that actually pulls back the military empire.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. Can we redesign our institutions for genuine inclusion, or will the empire simply shift its course again? The research we've explored today suggests that the machinery of control is vast, it's bipartisan, and it is deeply embedded. But it also shows us exactly where the levers of change are located. Ultimately, it's up to an informed public to decide whether to pull them. I highly encourage you to dive into the source material yourself to learn more about the reality of the political systems governing us. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.